Naomi Kessler sat alone on the exam table, the thin paper crinkling beneath her every time she shifted her weight, and she would spend the rest of her life remembering the particular sound of that crinkle, the way it seemed too loud for a room that was about to go so quiet. She was 18 weeks pregnant. She was 26 years old. And she had driven herself to this appointment because somewhere in the last few months, she had stopped expecting her husband to come at all. The clock on the wall read 9:40 in the morning. Outside the window, she could see the gray edge of a Pennsylvania winter refusing to let go of March frost, still clinging to the corners of the parking lot where her car sat alone in the third row. She had chosen that spot on purpose, far enough from the entrance that no one would notice how long she sat there afterward, not knowing yet that she would need every one of those extra steps to compose her face before walking back into the world. She did not know yet what was coming. She only knew that something inside her had felt tight all morning, the kind of tightness she used to feel as a girl when a storm was building over the fields long before anyone else could see the clouds. To understand what she lost in that room, you have to understand what she had already given up to get there. Naomi had grown up in a world without electricity, without cars, without mirrors larger than a hand could cover. She was raised Amish, not the loosened kind some outsiders imagine when they hear the word, but the real thing, the kind where a horse pulled the buggy into town and a girl sewed her own dresses from bolts of plain cloth and wore a prayer covering every day of her life from the time she could walk. She had loved parts of that world more than she would ever be able to explain to someone who had not lived inside it. The quiet of it, the rhythm of hands doing honest work from sunrise to dusk, the feeling of belonging to something so much larger than herself that her own wants seemed almost embarrassing to mention out loud. But even as a girl selling eggs at the edge of her family's gravel drive, she had known there was a shape to her life that did not fit the one she had been given. She wanted to choose, not out of rebellion, not out of anger at her family, but out of something quieter and more stubborn that she could never fully name even to herself. There is a particular memory she returns to, often from when she was maybe 9 years old, standing barefoot in the henhouse while her mother, Salome Kessler, showed her how to candle an egg against a lantern flame to check for cracks hidden beneath the shell. "You cannot always see the break from the outside," her mother had told her that morning, her voice patient, the way it always was back then before everything between them changed. "Sometimes you have to hold a thing up to the light to know if it will hold." Naomi did not understand at 9 years old how much that single lesson would come to mean to her 20 years later. She met Dalton Marsh when she was 21. He was an electrician working a job for an English family whose property bordered her father's farm. And for almost a year, he did nothing more than lift 2 fingers off the wheel of his truck each morning when he passed her stand. She would look up from arranging the eggs in their cartons, and there he would be, this quiet young man in a work shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, offering her a small wave, like it was nothing at all. And every single time something in her would stir in a way she refused to name. When he finally spoke to her directly, it was to ask if the eggs were fresh. That was the whole conversation. But it was the way he looked at her while he asked it, like she was a person standing in front of him, not a role sewn into a dress, not a girl behind a fence he was not permitted to cross. Something opened in her that day in a way she could not undo, and within a year she had made a decision that would cost her almost everything she had ever known. She wants you to understand what leaving actually meant. For most people watching this, leaving a family might mean an awkward phone call, a strained holiday dinner once a year. For Naomi, it meant losing her mother, her father, all 6 of her brothers and sisters, the only language she had ever spoken at a kitchen table. It meant being shunned formally and completely by the community that had raised her. Her own mother would not sit across a table from her for almost 4 years afterward. The morning she left, she remembers standing at the end of the gravel drive with one suitcase and the same wicker egg basket she had carried every Saturday of her childhood, and her mother standing at the fence line with her hands pressed flat against the top rail, not moving, not calling out, simply watching her daughter walk toward a car that would carry her into a world none of them understood. Naomi did not look back until she reached the end of the road, and by then her mother had already turned toward the house. She married Dalton when she was 23 in a small civil ceremony that none of her family attended, and for the first 2 years of that marriage, she believed with her whole heart that she had made the right choice. Dalton was patient with her in a way she had not expected from a man who had never had to learn anything the hard way himself. He taught her to drive on empty back roads on Sunday mornings, sitting calm beside her while she gripped the wheel too tightly. He taught her how a debit card worked, how a phone could hold 1,000 conversations inside it, and he never once made her feel foolish for not already knowing these things that everyone around her seemed to take for granted. She fell more in love with him during those quiet lessons than she had even been on the day she married him. He had become her whole world because she had built her entire new world around him, brick by brick, with nothing of her old life left to stand on. Somewhere around the start of their third year, something in him began to shift, so gradually at first that she told herself she was imagining it. He started working later into the evening. Phone calls would come after dinner, and he would step outside into the cold to take them, even in January, even when frost was already forming on the porch rail, which struck her as strange but not strange enough not yet to say anything about. He began sleeping with his phone tucked beneath his pillow instead of charging on the nightstand where it had always sat before. She noticed. She noticed all of it. The way a person notices a crack forming in a foundation long before they are willing to admit the whole house might be at risk. But when you have given up everything you have ever known for one man, you do not want to see the cracks. Seeing them means admitting you might have burned your whole life down for nothing. And so she told herself this was simply what marriage looked like after a few years. She told herself she was being ungrateful for a life that had cost her so much to build. It was around this time that Silas Marsh Dalton's older brother came for Sunday dinner, and something in the room felt different from the moment he walked through the door. Silas ran a small auto repair shop 2 towns over, a big quiet man with hands permanently stained at the knuckles from years of engine grease, and he had never been easy with words even on his best days. But that evening, he barely looked at Naomi when she asked how business was going, and when she mentioned in passing that Dalton had been working unusual hours lately, Silas's fork paused halfway to his mouth for just a beat too long before he set it down and changed the subject entirely. Later, while Dalton was outside checking on something in the truck bed that did not need checking, Silas lingered in the kitchen doorway as Naomi dried dishes at the sink. "He does not always tell you the whole truth," Silas said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes fixed instead on some point past her shoulder. Naomi turned a plate still in her hands. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. Silas's jaw worked for a moment like he was chewing on words he had already decided not to say. "Nothing," he said finally. "Forget I said it." He walked out before she could press further, and the screen door clapped shut behind him, with a sound that seemed to hang in the kitchen long after he had gone. She told herself it meant nothing. Brothers said strange things sometimes. But that sentence would sit in the back of her mind for weeks afterward, refusing to fully dissolve the way a splinter refuses to work its way out on its own. A few weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Naomi drove into town to the small farmer's market that set up in the square every spring, hoping to buy fresh strawberries for a pie she wanted to surprise Dalton with that evening. She was standing at a stall examining a basket of berries when a voice she had not heard in over 3 years spoke her name from behind her. She turned, and there stood Bishop Ezra Landis, a man who had presided over her family's church district since before she was born, a man whose disapproval had once felt like the weather itself, inevitable and impossible to argue with. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Ezra Landis had never needed volume to make a room feel smaller. "I heard you were still in town," he said, his eyes moving briefly to the small curve just beginning to show beneath her coat. "I suppose that answers what became of the life you thought you wanted more than your own family." Naomi felt her face go hot, aware suddenly of the small crowd of shoppers moving around them, several of whom had slowed their steps just slightly. "I did not come here to speak with you," she said, keeping her voice level, though her hands had gone cold around the basket handle. "No," he said. "You never do. You only come when it is convenient, and then you disappear again, same as you did the day you left your mother crying at that fence." She set the basket down and walked away without another word, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she did not stop walking until she reached her car 3 blocks away. She sat behind the wheel for a long time before she trusted her hands enough to drive. That evening, she did not tell Dalton what had happened. She was learning without fully realizing it yet to carry things alone. It was around the 7th month of that year, not long after the market, that the argument happened, the one she would later understand had been building for a long time beneath the surface of every quiet dinner and every missed phone call. She had scheduled her 3rd prenatal appointment for a Thursday afternoon, and Dalton had genuinely promised that he would be there. That morning, he called from a job site to say a client emergency had come up a burst pipe that could not wait, and could she please go on without him, he would make the next one. He swore it. She had gone alone. Again. That night, sitting across from him at their kitchen table while he ate reheated stew without really tasting it, she finally said what she had been holding back for weeks. "You have missed every single one," she said quietly. "Not most, every one." Dalton did not look up right away. When he finally did, something flickered across his face that she would spend the following weeks trying to understand, something that looked almost like panic dressed up as irritation. "I have a business to run, Naomi," he said, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it aimed at her before. "Not everyone gets to just show up whenever they feel like it. Someone has to pay for this house." "That is not fair," she said, her voice trembling now despite her effort to keep it steady. "I am not asking you to abandon your work. I am asking you to see your daughter's heartbeat on a screen. Just once." He pushed his chair back from the table hard enough that it scraped loudly against the floor, and for a moment she thought he might simply walk out of the room, the way he so often did lately when a conversation went somewhere he did not want it to go. Instead, he stood there, gripping the back of the chair, his knuckles pale. "You always do this," he said. "You always make it sound like I don't care. I care more than you know. You just don't see it because you're too busy imagining things that aren't there." The words landed like a slap, not because they were true, but because some small, frightened part of her wondered for a moment if they were. "I am not imagining the missed appointment," she said softly. "I am not imagining the phone under your pillow." Something shifted behind his eyes, then quick as a curtain falling, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt something close to fear sitting across the table from her own husband. "I am tired," he said finally, his voice suddenly flat and controlled again. "I am going to bed." He left the stew half-eaten and did not say another word to her that night. She sat alone at the table for a long while afterward, listening to the pipes groan upstairs as the shower turned on, and she found herself thinking unwillingly of that morning in the henhouse, of her mother holding an egg up to the lantern light. She wondered, staring at the cold stew, whether she had ever really held her own marriage up to any kind of light at all, or whether she had simply chosen again and again to trust the shell. 2 days later, standing at the sink washing the last of the dinner dishes, Naomi mentioned to her friend Odessa Vance, who had stopped by with a container of soup and a bag of secondhand baby clothes, that Dalton had missed another appointment. Odessa worked with Naomi at the small accounting office in town, and she had been one of the first people to befriend Naomi when she arrived in this English world, knowing almost nothing about how to move through it. Odessa set the container down on the counter and studied Naomi's face for a long moment before speaking. "Honey," she said carefully, "I am not trying to scare you, but something has felt off with him for a while now. You know that, right? You have felt it too." Naomi kept her eyes on the plate in her hands, scrubbing at a spot that had already come clean. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though of course she did. Odessa reached over and squeezed her wrist gently. "Just keep your eyes open," she said. "That's all I'm saying. You deserve someone who shows up." Naomi did not respond, but that night she lay awake long after Dalton had fallen asleep beside her, listening to the small sounds of the house settling around them, and she found herself doing something she had not done in months. She was paying close attention. When she found out she was pregnant in the early weeks of that winter, Dalton's reaction had seemed at the time like everything she could have hoped for. He had pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe, and when he finally let go, there were tears standing in his eyes that she had never seen there before. "I have been hoping for this for months," he had said, his voice thick. "You have no idea." She had cried against his shoulder that night, believing with everything in her that this baby would be the thing that healed whatever quiet distance had crept into their marriage over the past year, that a family of their own would pull them fully back together the way nothing else had managed to. But almost immediately, something strange began happening. Every single appointment she scheduled, something came up for Dalton. A client emergency, a meeting he had forgotten, a job that could not wait until tomorrow. At first, she told herself this was simply what husbands were like in the early months before there was anything exciting to see or hear on the screen. But by the third appointment, a pattern had begun to take shape in her mind that she did not yet have language for. It was not that he was busy. It was that he seemed to be actively avoiding the clinic itself, as though something inside that building frightened him more than any late invoice or burst pipe ever could. By the fourth appointment, she had stopped asking him to come at all. She told herself she was being considerate of his schedule. In truth, some quiet part of her had simply grown tired of watching him invent another excuse, and it was easier to accept an absence she had chosen to expect than one that surprised her every single time. Which brings her back to that Tuesday morning in March, sitting alone in the waiting room of Dr. Bridget Sawyer's office, scrolling absently through her phone, while she waited to be called back for what was supposed to be a routine 18-week checkup. She remembers feeling something unexpected as she sat there. Not sadness, not even loneliness. Something closer to peace, strange as that sounds, the sense that being alone in that particular moment was somehow easier than bringing the tension of her marriage into a room where she was supposed to be celebrating new life. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone you love that you kept talking yourself out of? Hold that question for a moment because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why it matters. When the nurse called her back, everything felt ordinary at first. Blood pressure, a few routine questions, small talk about the unexpected cold snap the region had been having. Then the nurse turned to the computer to pull up her chart, and Naomi watched something flicker across the woman's face, small enough that a person not paying close attention might have missed it entirely. The nurse glanced at the screen, then at Naomi, then back at the screen. "I am sorry," the nurse said, her voice carefully neutral. "I just want to double-check something before the doctor comes in." She did not think much of it in that moment. Medical offices made paperwork mistakes all the time, especially with insurance information. But the nurse stepped out of the room and did not return for nearly 10 minutes. And those 10 minutes stretched out endlessly, while Naomi sat there in a paper gown, with her pulse beginning to pound for reasons she could not yet explain. When Dr. Sawyer finally entered, she carried Naomi's chart in both hands, and instead of reaching immediately for the ultrasound wand the way she normally did, she pulled the small rolling stool close and sat down directly across from her patient. That was the first sign that something had changed. "Before we get started," Dr. Sawyer said gently, "I want to ask you something, and I hope it does not come across the wrong way. Is your husband's name Dalton Marsh?" Naomi felt a strange cold ripple move through her. "Yes," she said, confused because of course the doctor already had that information on file. Dr. Sawyer paused a beat longer than felt natural. "I just want to make sure we are not mixing up two charts," she said carefully. "We have another patient in our system listed under the same insurance policy as a dependent spouse of a Dalton Marsh. She was seen here just last Thursday. She is approximately 22 weeks along." The room seemed to go very quiet then. Not the doctor's voice exactly, but Naomi's own hearing, as though someone had reached out and turned the whole world down low. "That is not possible," Naomi heard herself say. "I am his wife." Dr. Sawyer looked at her with an expression Naomi would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not shock. It was something gentler and far more practiced. The look of a woman who had delivered some version of this sentence to other women in other rooms more times than she probably wanted to admit. "I understand this is a great deal," Dr. Sawyer said. "I wanted to check with you directly before saying anything further because insurance records can sometimes be incorrect. But both of you are listed under the same policy number as spouses with two separate dependent entries." Naomi sat perfectly still on that exam table, 18 weeks pregnant, and she genuinely could not process what she was hearing. Her first instinct, and she would later think this said something terrible about how deep denial could run in a person who had already sacrificed everything for one man, was to defend him. "There must be some kind of clerical error," she told the doctor. "Maybe it is an old policy from before we married. Maybe it is a coworker who was added by mistake." She offered every possible explanation except the one that would eventually prove true. Dr. Sawyer did not push. She simply offered gently to move forward with the ultrasound if Naomi wanted, or to reschedule if she needed time to collect herself. Naomi told her to continue because some numb, disconnected part of her needed to see that baby on the screen and remember why she had come there in the first place. She watched her daughter's heartbeat flicker steadily across the monitor, while somewhere in the quiet background of her own mind, her entire understanding of her marriage came apart without a single sound. She did not cry in that office. She wants that remembered clearly. She got dressed. She thanked Dr. Sawyer with a composure that surprised even her. She walked out to her car in the third row of the parking lot, and she sat there behind the wheel for nearly 45 minutes without once turning the key, watching her own breath fog faintly against the cold glass of the windshield, while the rest of the world moved on around her as though nothing at all had happened. Somewhere in that stillness, an old memory surfaced from her childhood. A summer evening on the farm, when a storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected, and her father had stood on the porch, watching the sky, saying nothing until the first hard drops began to fall. She remembered asking him why he had not run for cover sooner, and he had told her that some storms you cannot outrun, you can only decide how you are going to stand in them. She thought too of a man she barely knew, a retired county records clerk named Emmett Calloway, whom she had met only briefly at a neighborhood gathering. Odessa had dragged her to a few months earlier, a quiet, careful man who had spent 35 years of his life reading other people's paperwork for a living, and who had told a small story that evening about a file he wished he had looked at more closely years ago, before it was too late to matter. She had not understood at the time why that story had stayed with her. She understood it now, sitting alone in that parking lot with her hands finally beginning to shake. If you found out something like this about your partner, would you confront them immediately, or would you quietly start gathering proof? First, Naomi chose the second path, and it would change everything about how this story ended. That night, she said nothing to Dalton. She sat across from him at dinner and answered his questions about her day in a voice so calm it frightened her a little, telling him only that the appointment had gone fine, that the baby was measuring right on schedule. She watched him nod and return to his plate, utterly unaware that something enormous had already begun shifting beneath the surface of their marriage. She lay beside him that night, listening to his breathing, even out into sleep, and she stared up at the ceiling for a long time, thinking of her mother's face the day she had left the farm for good, thinking of Silas's unfinished sentence in the kitchen doorway, thinking of a bishop's cold words at a farmer's market, thinking of a quiet man named Emmett, who had once let a file sit unread for far too long. She thought of her daughter's heartbeat on that screen, steady and unaware of anything at all. And somewhere in the dark, long before she had gathered a single piece of proof, Naomi Kessler made a quiet decision that she would carry through everything that came next. She was done looking away from the cracks. Whatever they led to, she was finally going to see them clearly, no matter how much it cost her to look. Naomi did not sleep that night, not really. She lay in the dark, memorizing the ceiling, while a plan began forming inside her that felt less like a decision and more like something being handed to her, piece by piece, from some steadier version of herself she had not known existed until now. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would not confront Dalton. Not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. The next morning, while Dalton showered, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, her hands surprisingly still. She logged into the insurance portal they shared, something she had done only once or twice before always, for something ordinary, a copay, a prescription refund. It took her less than 5 minutes to find what she needed. Under their joint policy sat a second dependent entry, a woman's name she did not recognize listed as spouse, added 11 months earlier. 11 months. Not some leftover paperwork from before their marriage. 11 months, which lined up almost exactly with the season his phone had started disappearing beneath his pillow. She wrote the name down on the back of an envelope with a steadiness that surprised her. Harlow Bryce. She closed the laptop just as she heard the water shut off down the hall, and by the time Dalton walked into the kitchen in a clean shirt, reaching for his coffee mug, without once looking at her, she had already folded the envelope into her coat pocket and was slicing an apple at the counter as though nothing in the world had changed. If you are the kind of person who needs the whole truth before you allow yourself to feel anything at all, you already understand what she did next. She thought of Emmett Calloway. She had met him only once at a neighborhood gathering. Odessa had practically dragged her to. Months earlier, a quiet, gray-haired man in his late 60s who had spent 35 years behind the records counter at the county courthouse before retiring 2 winters ago. She remembered almost nothing of what he had said that evening, except one detail that had lodged itself in her memory without her understanding why. He had mentioned almost in passing a file he had once let sit unread for too long, and the way his voice had gone quiet around the edges of that memory, like a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. Odessa gave her the address without asking a single question, which told Naomi more about how much her friend already suspected than any conversation could have. Emmett's house sat at the end of a gravel lane outside town, small and neat, with a woodpile stacked in perfect rows along the side wall and a porch swing that looked freshly oiled. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, with reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair, and something in his face shifted the moment he saw her standing there, as though he recognized the particular kind of trouble she carried before she had said a single word. "You are Odessa's friend," he said, "the one who left the Amish." Naomi nodded, suddenly unsure how to begin. He stepped back from the door without asking anything further. "Come in," he said. "Whatever it is, it will sound better sitting down than standing on a porch in this wind." His kitchen table was covered in neat stacks of paper, old habits from a career spent organizing other people's lives into folders, and he cleared a space for her without comment, setting a cup of coffee in front of her that she did not touch. She told him everything: the missed appointments, the insurance entry, the name on the envelope. When she finished, Emmett sat quietly for a long moment, turning the envelope over in his weathered hands. "This is not simple infidelity," he said, finally, his voice low and careful. "If what you are describing is accurate, and both of you are listed as spouses under the same policy, that suggests he may be legally married to two women at once. That is not just a broken vow, Naomi. In this state, that is a crime. It is called bigamy." She felt the words settle somewhere deep inside her, heavier than she expected. Not shock exactly. She had already suspected something like it without having the language for it. Hearing it named out loud by a man who had spent his whole career reading fine print made it real in a way the insurance portal alone had not. Emmett's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment his eyes drifted to a spot on the wall behind her, somewhere far away. "Years ago," he said quietly, "there was a file that crossed my desk. A woman came in asking questions about her husband's property records, and something did not sit right with me. But I told myself it was not my business to go digging where I had not been asked. I let it go. 2 years later, I learned that man had done to her exactly what I suspect yours may be doing to you. I have thought about that file more times than I can count." He looked at her, then steady and clear-eyed. "I am not going to make that mistake twice," he said. "Whatever you need, I will help you find it." Something in Naomi loosened slightly for the first time in weeks, not relief exactly, but the strange comfort of no longer standing entirely alone. Over the following 10 days, Naomi built a picture of her marriage. She had never wanted to see working quietly in the evenings, while Dalton sat in the next room watching television, oblivious to the slow unraveling happening only a few feet away from him. A simple public records search turned up a second address tied to Dalton's name, a rental unit less than 15 minutes from their house in a small apartment complex she had driven past 100 times without ever once suspecting what it held. She thought of Silas then, the way his fork had paused over his plate that Sunday evening, the unfinished sentence he had left hanging in the kitchen doorway. She drove to his shop on a gray Wednesday afternoon, parking beside the open garage bay, where he stood bent over in engine grease, darkening the creases of his knuckles. "Silas," she said, standing just inside the doorway, "I need you to finish what you started saying to me weeks ago." He did not look up from the engine. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. "You do," she said, her voice firmer than she expected it to be. "I found her name, Silas, Harlow Bryce. I need to know how long you have known." His hands went still on the engine block. For a long moment, the only sound in the garage was the drip of something metallic somewhere overhead. Then, without turning around, he reached over and pulled the bay door down with a heavy metallic slam that echoed through the concrete space, cutting off the daylight and cutting off the conversation at the same time. "I have nothing to say to you," he said, his back still turned. "Go home, Naomi." She stood there a moment longer, stunned by the sudden coldness in a man who had always, in his quiet way, seemed to care about her. Then she turned and walked back out into the gray afternoon, her hands trembling with something between anger and heartbreak. She told Emmett what had happened that evening, sitting once again at his kitchen table, and he listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "Silas's father and I go back a long way," Emmett said finally. "Give me a day." She did not ask what he meant to do. Something in his voice told her not to. The following afternoon, Emmett drove out to the same repair shop, parking his old sedan beside the open bay where Silas worked. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and waited until Silas finally set down his wrench and looked at him. "Your father would be ashamed," Emmett said quietly, "of a son who lets a woman carry a truth alone that he has known for months." Silas's jaw tightened. "This is not my business," he said. "Dalton is my brother. And Naomi is carrying his child," Emmett said. "What do you think your father would have called a man who stayed silent while that happened?" The silence between them stretched long enough that Emmett turned to leave, satisfied he had said what needed saying. He was halfway to his car when Silas's voice stopped him. "Wait," Silas said, his voice suddenly smaller than Emmett had ever heard it. "There is a folder in my house. My mother kept some of Dalton's old paperwork after our father passed. I saw something in it once that I wish I had not seen." That evening, alone at home while Dalton worked late, Naomi received a text from an unknown number that simply read, "My brother's shop tomorrow morning, come alone." Around the same time, while sorting through old photographs on her phone one evening, Naomi found something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with Silas or Emmett at all. A photo posted publicly on social media under a slightly misspelled version of Dalton's name taken 4 months earlier, at what was clearly a baby shower balloon strung along a porch railing, a folding table covered in pastel wrapping paper. In the photo, Dalton stood with his arm wrapped around the waist of a very pregnant woman, smiling in a way Naomi had not seen him smile in over a year. The caption beneath the photo read simply, "So happy for my sister and her husband." Her sister. Naomi stared at that word for a long time, feeling something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the sheer scale of what she was beginning to understand. This woman had a family who believed Dalton belonged to them completely, who had thrown her a party, who had written that word with total conviction. She saved the photo without a word, her hands steady in a way that frightened her more than tears would have. 3 days later, unable to stop herself, Naomi drove to the address she had found in the public records parking half a block down the street, where she could watch the small apartment complex without being seen. She told herself she only wanted to see the building, nothing more. But she had been sitting there less than 10 minutes when the front door opened and a young woman stepped out onto the small stoop, one hand resting against the visible curve of her belly, the other shielding her eyes against the pale afternoon sun. Naomi recognized her instantly from the photograph. Harlow Bryce. Before she fully understood what she was doing, Naomi had stepped out of her car and started across the street. Harlow noticed her approach and stiffened some instinct, clearly warning her that this was not a random passerby. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice guarded. "I think you already know who I am," Naomi said quietly, stopping a few feet away. Harlow's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then something like recognition, and finally something that looked almost like dread. "You are her," she whispered. "His wife." The word landed strangely between them, both of them standing there claimed by the same title. "I did not know," Harlow said quickly, her hand moving instinctively to cover her belly, as though protecting it from the conversation itself. "I swear to you I did not know. He told me you two had separated. He said the divorce was almost finalized. He told me he was only waiting on paperwork." Naomi felt something inside her crack open, not from anger at this woman standing before her, but from the sudden dizzying realization that Harlow's face held the exact same disbelief, the exact same betrayal that Naomi herself had carried out of that exam room weeks earlier. "We are not so different, are we?" Naomi said softly, her voice trembling now despite herself. Harlow's eyes filled with tears. "He came to my sister's baby shower," she said. "He held my hand in front of 40 people. He told my mother he could not wait to be a father. Was any of it real for either of us?" The two women stood on that quiet street for a long moment, strangers bound together by the same man's lies, and something passed between them that was not quite friendship, not yet, but was no longer hostility either. A recognition, a shared wound. "I need to know everything you know," Naomi said finally. "Not to hurt you, to understand what he has done." Harlow hesitated, then nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Come inside," she said. "I think we both deserve to finally know the truth." Sitting at Harlow's small kitchen table 20 minutes later, Naomi learned the final piece of the puzzle that would change everything. Harlow had married Dalton 8 months earlier in a small courthouse ceremony 2 counties over. She pulled up a photo on her phone of the marriage certificate, proud of it once, before everything had come apart. Naomi stared at the document on the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The name printed beside Harlow's read Dalton Marsh. Not Dalton R. Marsh, the name on Naomi's own marriage certificate, the name that had been passed down from his father. "He told me his middle name was Alan Harlow," said quietly, watching Naomi's face change. "He said his family had always called him Dalton, but that Alan was on all his legal paperwork. I never thought to question it." Naomi felt the full weight of what that meant settle over her like something physical. He had used a slightly altered version of his own legal name specifically to keep the two marriages from ever crossing paths. In any records search, a small, deliberate lie buried inside a much larger one. That evening, Naomi received a call from Silas. His voice was rough, stripped of the coldness from days earlier. "Come to the shop," he said. "I have something you need to see." The folder Silas handed her the following morning contained copies of Dalton's original birth certificate, his Social Security paperwork, old documents their mother had kept in a box after their father passed. Everything confirmed what Harlow's marriage certificate had already suggested. Dalton had legally altered how he presented his middle name specifically for the second marriage, creating just enough distance between the two records that a routine background check would never connect them. "I should have told you the day you asked me at dinner," Silas said, standing in the doorway of his shop with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, unable to meet her eyes. "I found some of this months ago going through Mom's things. I did not want to believe it either. Naomi did not answer right away. She simply reached out and rested a hand briefly on his arm, a small gesture that seemed to steady something in both of them at once. "Thank you for telling me now," she said quietly. "That is what matters." That Sunday evening, Naomi called Dalton and asked him to come home early, telling him only that they needed to talk. Emmett had offered to wait outside in his car down the street, not to intervene, simply to be near, in case she needed him. And something about knowing he was there settled the trembling in her hands as she waited at the kitchen table for the sound of Dalton's truck in the driveway. When he walked in, he must have sensed immediately that something had shifted, because his easy smile faltered the moment he saw the folder and photograph spread across the table in front of her. Naomi laid it all out calmly without raising her voice. The insurance records, the second address, the photograph from the baby shower, Harlow's name, the marriage certificate with his altered middle name. Dalton stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, and she watched something collapse behind his eyes, the performance of the last year finally falling away all at once. He did not deny any of it. He sat down slowly across from her, the same chair he had scraped back so violently weeks earlier during their argument about the missed appointments, and for a long time he said nothing at all, staring down at his own hands resting on the table. "I did not know how to choose," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. That was it. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a quiet admission that somewhere along the way he had decided he simply was not going to choose at all, and instead he would let two women build entire futures around him without either of them ever knowing the other existed. Naomi sat very still, feeling something inside her go completely quiet, the way the world goes quiet in the last moment before a storm finally breaks. "You built two entire lives," she said softly. "Two women, two children. And you were just going to let us both keep believing we were the only one." Dalton did not answer. He simply stared at his hands. And in that silence, Naomi understood with absolute clarity that whatever she had once believed about this man, whatever she had sacrificed her entire family to build with him, was already gone, had perhaps never fully existed at all outside of her own hope. She stood up from the table, her legs unsteady, but her voice, when it finally came, was perfectly clear. "I am leaving," she said, "and I am not doing this quietly." Outside, through the kitchen window, she could just make out the shape of Emmett's car parked at the curb, its headlights off, waiting. Naomi left the house 4 days later on a Thursday morning while Dalton was at a job site carrying 2 suitcases and a small box of things that had belonged to her before she had ever met him. Things she had kept hidden in the back of a closet for years without fully understanding why. Odessa met her in the driveway and helped load the car without asking a single question. And Naomi would remember for the rest of her life the particular kindness of a friend who simply opens a door instead of asking why it needs opening. She stayed in Odessa's spare room that first week, sleeping in a narrow bed beneath a window that faced east, waking each morning to light that felt unfamiliar in a house that was not her own. She did not cry as often as she expected to. Mostly she felt a strange, hollowed-out quiet, the sensation of a person standing in the wreckage of something and realizing slowly that she was still breathing. On the second night, Dalton showed up at Odessa's front door. Naomi heard his voice before she saw him, low and pleading through the screen door, asking Odessa to let him speak with his wife. Odessa stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, refusing to move aside, and Naomi came up quietly behind her, close enough to see Dalton standing on the porch steps. In the porch light, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed in a way she had never seen before. "Please," he said, looking past Odessa directly at Naomi. "Just 5 minutes, that is all I am asking." "You had 4 years," Naomi said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You do not get 5 more minutes." Something in his expression shifted, then the pleading falling away, and something colder rising up in its place. "If you take this to court," he said, his voice tightening, "I will fight you for custody." "I mean it, Naomi. I know people. I know how these things go." Odessa stepped forward slightly, her voice sharp. "You need to leave," she said, "right now." Dalton lingered a moment longer, his eyes moving to Naomi's belly, to the small curve she had not yet learned to stop protecting with her own arms, and something in his face flickered regret or calculation. She could not tell which. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, and Naomi stood in the doorway watching his taillights disappear down the street, her hands trembling with something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but some new, harder thing she did not yet have a name for. Odessa closed the door and locked it, then turned to Naomi with a fierce, protective look in her eyes. "He does not get to threaten you," Odessa said. "Not anymore." That threat, however, was enough to send Naomi back to Emmett's kitchen table the following morning, this time with a decision already forming in her mind that had nothing to do with insurance records or missed appointments and everything to do with what came next. I want this to be real, she told him, sitting across from the same stacks of paper that had once felt like a stranger's kitchen and now felt almost like a second home. Not just something I know is true, something a court knows is true. Emmett nodded slowly, folding his hands together on the table. Then it is time we brought this to the district attorney, he said. What Dalton has done is not just a broken marriage, Naomi. It is a crime against the state itself, and the state does not let that go unanswered once it knows. 3 days later, Emmett drove into town alone, a thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. 35 years of careful habit guiding his hands as he organized each document in the precise order he knew would matter most to someone reading it cold. He parked outside the county courthouse, the same building where he had spent most of his working life, and walked up the familiar steps one more time. Not as an employee now, but as a private citizen carrying something he had once let slip through his fingers and was determined not to let slip again. He set the folder on the counter in the district attorney's office and spoke plainly to the young clerk who greeted him. My name is Emmett Calloway, he said. I worked these halls for 35 years, and I am asking you to look very closely at what is inside this folder, because a young woman is carrying a child who deserves to grow up knowing the truth was not buried a second time. The clerk, recognizing his name from years of quiet reputation around the building, promised the file would reach the right desk by the end of the day. Emmett walked back out into the cold afternoon light, feeling something loosen in his chest that had sat there tight and unresolved for longer than he cared to admit even to himself. He thought of the file he had let sit untouched all those years ago, and for the first time in a long while, the weight of it felt lighter. The investigation moved faster than Naomi expected. Within 2 weeks, formal charges had been filed against Dalton Marsh for bigamy, a felony offense in the state, and a court date was set for a preliminary hearing that would determine whether the case moved forward to trial. Naomi sat in the small wood-paneled courtroom on the morning of the hearing, Odessa on one side of her, Emmett on the other, his presence steady and unshaken beside her, the way it had been since the night she first knocked on his door. Across the aisle, Dalton sat beside a lawyer in an expensive suit, his face pale and drawn, no longer the confident man who had once waved to her over a fence for nearly a year before ever speaking a word. Dalton's lawyer stood when it was his turn to speak, and instead of addressing the charges directly, he turned his attention toward Naomi herself, his voice smooth and practiced. Your Honor, he said, I would like to note for the record that the plaintiff spent the majority of her adult life within an insular religious community with no exposure to modern legal or financial systems until quite recently. It raises reasonable questions about her ability to accurately interpret complex documents such as insurance policies and public records. Naomi felt heat rise through her, the old shame of the farmer's market rising up, unbidden the memory of a bishop's cold words about a life she had supposedly thrown away. She gripped the edge of her chair, forcing herself to sit still. Emmett rose from his seat before she could say anything at all. Your Honor, if I may. Emmett said, his voice carrying the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had spent 35 years being taken seriously in that exact room. I spent my career here reviewing exactly these kinds of records. Insurance filings, marriage certificates, public documents. I did not find these discrepancies difficult to interpret. In fact, Mrs. Marsh identified the irregularities in her insurance policy before I did. Her background is not a weakness in this case. It is simply irrelevant to the facts in front of you. The judge nodded slightly, making a note, and Dalton's lawyer sat back down without further argument, the attempt to discredit her having failed as quickly as it had begun. It was Harlow who delivered the final blow to whatever hope Dalton still carried of walking away untouched. She had agreed in the days following their conversation at her kitchen table to provide a sworn statement to investigators, and now she sat in the witness section of the courtroom, her hand resting protectively over the same curve Naomi recognized from their first meeting on that quiet street. When she was called to testify, Harlow spoke clearly and without hesitation, describing the courthouse wedding, the altered middle name on the certificate, the year of birthday dinners and holiday visits with her family, that Dalton had built entirely on a foundation of lies. She did not look at Dalton once while she spoke. When she finished, she walked back to her seat and, passing Naomi in the aisle, reached out and briefly squeezed her hand, a gesture that said more than any words could have. The preliminary hearing concluded with the judge ordering the case forward to full prosecution, the evidence deemed more than sufficient to proceed. Dalton's electrical contracting license, tied to a state background check that flagged the pending felony charge, was suspended within the month, and word of what he had done moved through the small town the way word always does, in places where everyone still recognizes everyone else's truck in a parking lot. A short article ran in the local paper under a modest headline, and within weeks Dalton's client list had dried up entirely, the quiet, steady work he had built his reputation on for over a decade collapsing under the weight of what he had hidden behind it. Naomi did not attend the sentencing hearing months later. She sent Emmett in her place, and he returned that evening to tell her simply that it was finished, that Dalton would carry the conviction with him for the rest of his life, and that some debts once exposed to daylight do not get to hide again. 6 weeks after she had left the house on that gray Thursday morning, Naomi's phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, the way she had learned to do with unfamiliar callers over the past several difficult weeks. Something made her answer instead. The voice on the other end was quiet, uncertain, achingly familiar, despite the years that had passed since she had last heard it. "Naomi," her mother said. "It is Salome." Naomi sat down slowly at Odessa's kitchen table, her free hand pressed flat against her collarbone, as though she could hold herself steady by force. She had not heard her mother's voice in almost 5 years, not since the day she had watched her turn back toward the house without a word. "I heard what happened," her mother said carefully, her voice carrying the particular cadence of a language Naomi had not spoken aloud in years, though she understood every word of it perfectly. "The community hears things, even things we do not ask to hear. I am sorry it was not what you thought it would be." Naomi felt tears rising hot and sudden, the first real tears she had allowed herself since that afternoon in the parking lot outside Dr. Sawyer's office. "Mama," she managed, the old word for mother slipping out of her before she could stop it. "You left us for a life you thought was safe," Salome said softly. "I am sorry it was not. Come home if you need to, just to visit. Nothing more than that if that is all you can give." Naomi closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years passed between them in that single sentence. An offer extended without demand, without judgment. Simply a door left open after so long being closed. "I am not coming back to stay," Mama Naomi said gently. "That part of my life is closed now, but I would like to see you. I would like you to know your granddaughter." There was a long pause on the line, and when her mother spoke again, her voice had thickened with something that might have been tears of her own. "I would like that very much," Salome said. They spoke for nearly an hour that evening, careful and halting. At first, then easier as old rhythms of speech returned to them both, and by the time Naomi finally hung up the phone, something inside her that had been clenched tight for 5 long years had finally quietly begun to loosen. A few days later, a short text arrived on Naomi's phone from a number she did not recognize at first until she saw the name attached: Bishop Ezra Landis. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. "I heard the truth of what happened to you," the message read. "I was wrong to speak to you the way I did that day at the market. I hope you will forgive an old man his pride. I wish you and your daughter well." Naomi read the message twice, feeling something settle quietly in her. Not quite forgiveness yet, but the beginning of something close to it. She did not reply right away. Some wounds she was learning deserved time before they were asked to fully close. Over the following months, Naomi rebuilt her life slowly and deliberately, the way a person rebuilds a house from a foundation they know is finally solid. She rented a small apartment of her own 2 towns over, close enough to Odessa that they saw each other most weekends, close enough to Emmett that she stopped by his kitchen table more evenings than either of them bothered to count. Some evenings they did not talk about the case at all, simply sat together while he sorted through old photographs of a wife he had lost years earlier, a woman Naomi never met but felt somehow that she was beginning to know through the careful way Emmett spoke of her. She and her mother spoke by video call every Sunday evening, the awkwardness between them softening a little more each time. And twice that spring, Salome made the drive into town herself, sitting stiffly at first in Naomi's small living room, before finally on the second visit, reaching out to rest a hand against Naomi's growing belly, the way she once had when Naomi was a girl helping deliver calves on the farm. Silas came by more often than Naomi expected, too quiet as always, but steady in a way that told her he was trying in his own halting fashion to make up for the silence he had kept for far too long. He fixed the brakes on her car without being asked and refused to let her pay him for it. One evening he stayed for dinner, and for the first time since the day he had slammed the bay door shut between them. He laughed at something she said. a short surprise sound, as though he had forgotten he still had it in him. Harlow, in the strangest turn of all, became something Naomi never could have predicted on that first tense afternoon outside a rental apartment. They were not close friends, not exactly, but they checked in on each other from time to time. Two women who understood something about each other that almost no one else in either of their lives ever could, bound together by a shared wound that had, against every expectation, become something closer to solidarity than resentment. Harlow gave birth to a son that spring, 4 weeks before Naomi's own daughter was due, and she sent a single photograph with no caption at all, which Naomi understood perfectly without needing a single word attached to it. Naomi's daughter was born on a warm morning in the first week of July, 7 pounds, and loud voice from her very first breath, and Naomi held her in a hospital room with Odessa on one side and her own mother Salome on the other, 3 generations of women in one small room for the first time in over 5 years. She named her daughter Grace not out of any lingering feeling for the man whose name the child would never carry, but because it was the word that kept surfacing in her mind through every hard, uncertain month that had led her to this one. The sense that something larger than her own choices had carried her through. Emmett visited the following week, standing a little awkwardly in the doorway of Naomi's apartment, with a small, carefully wrapped gift in his weathered hands, a child-sized wooden box he had built himself in his garage workshop. The kind of thing a man makes when words feel insufficient for what he actually means to say. "For keeping safe things worth keeping," he said simply, setting it on the table. Naomi looked up at him, this quiet man who had once let a file sit unread out of fear of overstepping, who had spent 35 years reading other people's secrets without ever getting to choose which ones mattered most, and who had finally, when it counted, chosen to look closely instead of looking away. "You already did that for me," she said. "Thank you for not letting it sit this time." Emmett's eyes grew bright for a moment, and he simply nodded, unable to find words equal to what passed between them in that small, ordinary kitchen. Some evenings now, Naomi sits by the window of her apartment, with Grace asleep against her shoulder, watching the last light fade over rooftops, so different from the fields she grew up walking, and she finds herself thinking not of the marriage that ended, but of everything that grew up quietly in its place. A friend who opened a door without asking questions. A stranger who chose this time not to look away. A brother who finally found his voice. A woman who might have been an enemy and became something closer to an ally. A mother who called first after 5 long years of silence because some love, it turns out, does not require an apology to survive only an open door. She thinks too of that exam room, the paper crinkling beneath her, the doctor's careful, gentle sentence that unraveled everything she thought she knew. She understands now what she could not have understood then, that the truth rarely arrives with fireworks. Most of the time, it slips in quietly through a nurse double-checking a chart, through a folder someone finally has the courage to open, through a phone call from a mother who has waited 5 years to say she is sorry. Grace stirs against her shoulder, small fingers curling instinctively around the collar of her mother's shirt, and Naomi presses a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, feeling for the first time in longer than she can remember entirely at peace with the life she chose, and the one against every fear she carried into that exam room alone, she finally managed to build.